thank you so much for being here. I mean, I admire you. It's the end of the day and you come for a presentation on a boring topic, but that's good. So I'm Frédéric Devien. I manage IoT and embedded programs at the Eclipse Foundation, and with me is
Javier Palinho. Thank you for joining us in this session for standardization.
So really, if there's one thing you should remember about this presentation, it's this. I get a standard. E gets a standard. You get a standard. Everyone gets a standard, right? And the point that I'm trying to make, or that we are trying to make in this presentation, is really that it's not that difficult to get one on the way. It's much harder to get the specification done. But once you've got that, it's fairly easy to make a standard out of it, and we'll provide you a few tips about that. But first, let's take a step back. Why are standards so important? And there's a little story there. So you see here an image from the great Baltimore fire of 1904. And really, there was, oh, come on, that's not my clicker. So there was massive destruction in the city. So really, there was a huge area of the city that was completely razed by that particular fire. And you will ask me, what's the relationship to standards? Well, the thing is this. That blaze burned for 2 whole days, okay? And you would think, okay, maybe they didn't have, enough people, to fight against the fire. But no, there were over 1,000 firefighters on the ground. Then you will think maybe there was not enough equipment to fight against the fire. But no, there was plenty of equipment from neighboring cities in the US. So the reason why the fire burned for 2 days is this. There were no equipment or procedure standards. So you have a bunch of firefighters with pipes that don't fit together. Their hoses are not compatible, they don't have standard fittings, they don't have anything standard, and when they solve that problem, they don't operate in the same way. Should we start by the top, by the bottom, or whatever, use water straight away or something else? It was a complete mess, and this is why so much of the city was destroyed. So standards are really, really important, even if sometimes they are cumbersome because you have to comply with them, because they enable interoperability. And of course, interoperability in technology is a very, very good thing. All right, so there are 4 major sections to this presentation. So first, we'll try to understand what standardization exactly is, and what is the relationship of the Eclipse Foundation with SDOs, or standards, come on. Definition organizations, thank you. And then, of course, we've got a specification process at the Eclipse Foundation, so we'll talk about that and provide a few success stories, because yes, there are existing Eclipse specifications that are international standards or on their way to be international standards. All right, so standardization. So first, one thing important to understand is the difference between a specification and a standard. Oh. So a specification is really something you document, right? So you write in great detail something, or propose a plan to realize something, right? And most Eclipse specifications are technical specifications, so you write in a document what a piece of software should do to solve a specific problem, okay? And in very, very excruciating detail sometimes. Now, on the other hand, we've got the notion of standard. And standard, the one important word in this definition, there are automated timings in there. I'm sorry, I'm not mashing the buttons, I swear to you. So really, the word that's important there on a standard is the fact that it's, there's an authority at play there. So someone is deciding that this specification becomes a standard. And because of that, people, for regulatory reasons or compliance reasons, are forced in a way or another to implement it or to be compliant to it. Okay, so that's the big distinction between those two things.
Thank you, Frederic. So now, how are we doing, specification in Eclipse? So there is a process to do specification. Come on. So,
sorry.
At the end of the day, for doing specification, we need a collective technical agreement for all the members that are producing this kind of specification. And one important thing of the process is that between this community of members that are doing, this specification together, there is no prevalent membership contribution that is ruling the way this specification is moving forward. And at the end of the day, it is well documented and it is ready for implementation. And we are the ones, as the Eclipse Foundation, able to provide that this is happening the right way. So I let it go for this time. Why should I specify something? So that's the question. So you don't need to specify everything, and you don't need to standardize everything. At the end of the day, it is just a compromise. It is just about knowing if what you have in hand, it's susceptible to be specified or not. So what are the things you should be considering if you are wanting to have this process? So is whatever we are doing aligned with the already existing standard industry trends? So that's a relevant question. So are you going to do something groundbreaking? Is it something that is already aligned with something others are doing? So do you want to have a broader audience for whatever you are doing so that you can expand and you can increase the adoption and the reuse of what you are doing? One important thing, are you willing to let go and cooperate? Because if you are doing something on your own, you can keep control of the full specification, you can keep control of everything that's happening, but if you are willing to go the standard way, you will have to let go at one point. And others should be able to collaborate, others should be able to contribute, and you should be able to address everything together in a consensuated way so that whatever you end up with is not just your vision, it's everybody's vision. So that's a relevant question. And why should I be willing to let go something that is mine in which benefit? So because through this collaboration, you will boost your networking opportunity. So you will meet other people around the globe that are interested in the same topic you are interested in, and therefore you can contribute together, and they will provide you with the feedback, relevant feedback. They will provide you with relevant stories about how are they using it. So at the end of the day, you will enrich whatever you are doing through the collaboration on the community.
Yeah. And alignment with existing standards is so important because, as you mentioned, if you are groundbreaking, you can go on your own, but it's very rare nowadays that nothing exists in a specific space. And so being respectful of existing experts that have performed work for years and years in the space is really important if you want your own standard to be accepted.
Indeed, indeed. So we try to provide you with a sort of checklist. So if you are considering starting a collaboration project for open standardization, open specification, you should be thinking about this. So do I really need a standard? So that's the entry question, right? So I am assuming you are answering yes. So why do I need a standard? What I am assuming this standard will bring us back to the community, to the concrete organization. So what will I do once I have this standard? So that's the relevant question. So you are looking for a standard, so what are you going to do with it? Are you just looking at adoption? So are you doing this standard so others can use whatever you are using and therefore trying to bring everybody in the same direction, using the same things, therefore enabling this interoperability, these kind of ideas? So the follow-up question is then a standard needed, or what you are looking for is developing a community? So there are two different things. So one thing is standardizing, but it is not directly providing you with adoption. So if you want adoption, you need to do both things, standardizing and creating the community. But it might be enough with just the community. So that's something you need to consider whenever you are doing this. Second question, linking to Frederick's comment. It is not just about having dozens of standards. I am sure you saw this joke about 13 standards already available, and somebody saying, that's crazy. We cannot have 13 standards. Let's do something to group them all. And then you end up with 14 standards. So that's not the point. If there are other standards, contribute to those standards that are reviewed periodically, so they can be extended and used with your inputs as well. It makes no sense to do standards just for the sake of doing standards. Then, linking to the previous things we were discussing as well, are you willing to cooperate? So you will have to let go, as we were saying. Collaboration is the key for standards, and one important thing on standards is that they are driven by consensus. So they won't be approved unless everybody is on the same page for what you are doing.
And not only that, but once consensus is reached, you are not permitted to go back on previous consensus unless there's new data to consider. And they take that very seriously. So once everyone is on the same page, don't start it again because people will be very mad at you. It's already hard enough to get to the initial consensus.
Indeed. And then the very pragmatic question. So are you willing to devote the needed time and the needed resources in order for this to happen? Because you will have to debate a lot, you will have to discuss a lot, you will have to network a lot, you will have to study beforehand what are other standards doing, you will need to position, you will need to find the right experts, so it's a time-consuming task. Therefore, if you are in, you should be all in for doing these standards.
Exactly. And one thing worth mentioning about adoption, it's really important. If you want to make an international standard out of your spec, you need already significant adoption. If you just wrote a very brilliant spec and get it through the Eclipse spec process, but there's only a single reference implementation somewhere, that's not good enough. You need to show to the standardization community that there's a broad group of actors from various industry segments and various types of organizations that are involved, supporting and working on this. Otherwise, grow it a bit, and wait a bit before getting further.
And just for closing this section, that's the way specification and international standards are linking together, so to say. So the loop through which we can work together, starting left to right, those are the drivers, let's say. For instance, for some particular things, the ones that we will be explaining later on for data spaces, IoT, and Sparkplug, there might be a regulatory push, such as what we can see on the Cyber Resilience Act and the Data Act from the European Commission. There might be interest from a given set of organizations, ecosystems, trying to push forward some ideas in the form of open specification, and then the subsequent step would be doing the open source specification and open source adoption of those things. So this is what we can do at the Eclipse Foundation, and then we can transpose everything we are doing on the open source umbrella into standardization through SDOs, as you can see, ISO, IEC, SensenLX, so they will gather whatever we are doing as a specification, and then we will try to transpose those into standards. And whenever those standards are ready, we will be able to certify based on what those standards are trying to develop. And having said so, the floor is yours, Frederic, for the next.
Thank you. So the goal of this section is really to give you a taste of the broad universe of standardization. And you will see, we'll mention a few organizations. There are many more that are not included. I'm not pretending that we are completely exhaustive there. And really, each organization has its own little quirks in the way that it works and its focus and all of that. So don't expect or don't think that what would be true for one is necessarily true across the board. So you have to learn a bit about the specific organization you are targeting before determining how you would engage with it, okay? But here are a few standards development organizations that we currently care about at the foundation, among the staff at least, and of course in our community members. So the first one is the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, going back to 1906, and it's defined as a standards association. So it's not quite a non-governmental association, it's a weird little thing that exists let's say, at the international level. And really, their focus is on electrical technology initially, and then they added electronics and related fields. Then we've got in the US the IEEE, so worldwide renowned professional association for engineers, but they do standards as well. But their focus is really on electrical, electronics, and they added computer engineering after a few years. And as you see, it's much newer, much more recent than the IEC. Then we've got the ISO. ISO goes back to 1947. It's a non-governmental association, and the field there is much broader. So we have lots of technical standards like ISO 9001, you know, for the way enterprises are structured and operate, and they have standards for food safety, transport, agriculture, and things like that. But they do a bit related to technology, and at some point, ISO and IEC were fighting among themselves to decide which one would be the home to information technology standards back in the 80s. And finally, in typical standardization way, they reached a compromise and created ISO IEC JTC 1. JTC 1 means Joint Technical Committee 1. And so it's a kind of joint venture between ISO and IEC. Okay, and when you talk about JTC1, you have to put the ISO IEC before. Okay, don't just say ISO JTC1 or IEC JTC1, because some people are more partial than others and will look at you with big eyes, so don't do that. But JTC1 is really the place where information technology standards live, and that's where we started in terms of standardization at the Eclipse Foundation, because of course we are an IT-related nonprofit, so it was obviously the place where it should start. And then there's the ITU. ITU is an agency of the United Nations, so it's the only one which is an actually governmental body, you would say. And in their case, they determine satellite orbits, radio spectrum, but they have networking technical standards as well. And of course, networking is really important in IT, so they are also relevant to the kind of work that we do. So all of those organizations have their own way in the way that they operate. But of course, ISO and IEC are more closely aligned because of JTC1. You will see there are a few nuances, but typically what is true of ISO is true of IEC. And so if we look at the way things operate inside, okay, ISO has this notion of a technical committee, and it's true for IEC as well. But in the case of ISO, they just have the committee level. IEC adds the notion of a technical subcommittee inside the committee, okay? But both technical committees and technical subcommittees can have working groups, but those working groups have different names sometimes, okay? Sometimes they call it plain working group, which is a long-standing effort on a specific team. But sometimes it will be an advisory group, so it's a kind of governance body deciding the strategy. And sometimes it's an ad hoc group, which is a time-bound initiative to deliver some deliverable, and after that, the working group disappears. So that's an ad hoc group. So it's very maddening at first because you see all of those terms and you have no idea what they mean. And you learn over time, so this is the short version. And so whatever the structure is, ultimately when you have a committee, there's always a committee chair. Okay, so that's a member of the standardization community, you know, driving the show, driving the agendas with the assistance, of course, of the other experts. And then there's always a committee manager or secretary, depending on which body we talk about. And the committee manager is the person making things happen. It's a bit like Gesine at the Eclipse Foundation. She drives us and drills us in what we need to do on a schedule. So the committee manager sends the emails, shares the documents ahead of time, and does logistical things for the meeting to happen, for example, okay? So both roles are really, really important, but typically when you need something done, you talk to the committee manager first. And then at the working group level is where actual standardization work happens, okay? And a working group will have a number of standard projects in various stages of the life cycle. But there are two important roles there. First is the convener, so that's the chair, let's say, of the working group, the person, once again, coordinating all of the efforts. And then there's the editor role. Being an editor on a standard means you're literally one of the people actually working the stuff, okay? Or writing the stuff. And there can be a number of editors on a project and co-editors and things like that, but they are the ones performing the work and the other experts will just provide feedback, okay? So if someone tells you, oh, would you have a bit of time? Do you want to be an editor on this project? think carefully about this because that's a lot of work, of course. Lots of additional meetings that other members on the technical committee or the working group wouldn't participate in. All right, so the participants in those international organizations or standards definition organizations, there are really three categories. First, national experts. So they are members of what we call a mirror committee for their country. So I'm from Canada. So in Canada, we have a Canadian committee for specific ISO, specific IEC, and specific ISO, IEC JTC1 committees. Okay? This means Canadian experts meet together to decide will they vote for or against a standard, what kind of feedback they will propose. And this happens for every country which is a member of a specific committee. Okay, so there are committees all over the place. If you don't like meetings, standardization is not for you. Okay, of course, they can represent those experts themselves or their employers. So I'm an individual expert on the SC7 Mirror Committee for software engineering. Thank you. And then I represent the Eclipse Foundation at the JTC1 level so that we can present reports directly to the full JTC1 body as well. Okay? And so it's always one vote per country or national body. And depending on your country, the name of the national body may be different depending if we talk about ISO or IEC. So in the case of Canada, it's the same national body representing both on ISO and IEC and JTC1. And in some other countries, you have two distinct bodies doing that work. So it can get quite complicated. So please find a friendly local country expert that can explain that for you for your particular country. Okay? Then there are the concept of liaison officers, and Javier and myself are liaison officers on a number of subcommittees. And there, we represent the Eclipse Foundation. And liaison officers can only represent their employers, but they have no voting rights. But the only organizations that can establish liaisons with ISO, IEC, or JTC1 subcommittees are non-profit organizations with a global presence. And I oversimplify, there are other little twists there, but essentially you need to be a non-profit, you need to have members from various parts of the world, and you need to have a reason to be involved in the standards to be accepted. And we did, so that's great. Now, a third category is, of course, the staff of the SDO represented. So typically in committees, you will always have at least one person from ISO or IEC. And in the case of JTC1, some committees are hosted by ISO and others hosted by IEC. So the staff members representing the SDOs will vary because of that. So it can get, as you can see, quite messy, but you will figure it out if you get involved, no problem. And so what are we doing right now? So as I said, the foundation started with JTC1. And so right now we have a liaison with SC41 on IoT and digital twin. We started with that in 2022. We say it's a category A liaison. A category A means that we can join any working group whenever we want. Okay? There's also the concept of a category C liaison where a specific organization would join only a single working group. But since we never know what's ahead, typically we do category A's all the time to get the flexibility. Okay? And so in SC41, we are members of AG5 on long-term strategy. So that's where they discuss, you know, the high-level vision for this particular subcommittee. And we are members of Working Group 3 on cloud computing fundamentals and Working Group 5. And then I mixed up. I see the mistake. So the memberships on working groups are for SC38. You know, I mixed the two lines. Sorry about that. So in the case of SC41, we belong to Working Group 3 on IoT architecture and Working Group 6 digital twin. Okay, and there are two working groups. There's one on maritime or underwater IoT technologies, for example. That's very niche. We felt it was a bit too niche for us to have anything specific to contribute there, so we are not a member. Okay. In the case of SC38, we started a liaison with that since 2023, specifically to be able to participate in data space standardization. And so we've got a number of working group memberships because of that. And then finally, we requested the establishment of liaison with Subcommittee 27 on cybersecurity and security and privacy protection. Okay, and in this case, the liaison request is pending. We expect it to be approved before the end of the year. It takes many, many months in standardization for things to happen. Once it's there, myself and Michael Barbero will represent the Eclipse Foundation in the standardization work for SC27. Now, one concept before I hand to Javier, and I realize we are not explaining what this is the concept of a publicly available specification submitter. So Javier, maybe since we don't cover it in detail in the slide, maybe you should explain what that is.
Yeah, well, maybe we can discuss it through the slides because at the end of the day, it is kind of a process. So one thing is, as we were explaining, being a liaison, so we can be there as experts. And another thing is being a PAS submitter, a publicly available specification submitter. So that's a role that is given just to those organizations that are proving that they can do specification, which is the pre-standardization activity, in an open way. Therefore, what ISO IEC are acknowledging here is that whoever is a PAS submitter is able to do this previous work, and therefore they can transpose standards more quickly. So they can take out the first part of the process and directly go to the transposition. So looking it into a more visual way. So that's the usual way of doing standards. You start with some idea, you go through different working drafts and standardization drafts that are, each of those processes are lasting for a given period of months, and they are being balloted and voted after each process so that they can move forward and they can incorporate all the feedback that is coming from the national bodies and the experts, following all that line until the publication.
And that timeline is literally the best case. Things will go wrong and it will take more time than this naive estimate there that we've got.
That's right. So that is assuming that every vote, every balloting process goes right, and you are able to meet all the deadlines, and you are able to meet all the requirements that they are providing you for transposing this kind of activity. So as you can see, the most optimistic case for this to happen would be between 2 and 3 years. So that's the timeline whoever is willing to standardize should have in mind if they are not using a PAS submitter. What you can do whenever you go to a PAS submitter is, as we were saying, so we will somehow take over the first stages of the standardization activities. And by using this role of PAS submitter, ISO IEC, they are trusting that what we are doing is what they would have done if we would have started through their process. So we can start inside our working groups at the Eclipse Foundation doing open specification. We will make sure that we are doing it the right way, so that is what we are here for. And therefore, whenever there is a release on the specification, we can apply directly for transposition. As you can see, we will enter the flow on the middle, and we will just go for the approval of the transposition itself. So we are shortening the period, and we can make it still, most optimistic case, in less than a year. So that's the benefit of using somebody as the Eclipse Foundation for channeling the specification and standardization activities.
It's literally a fast track.
That's right. That's right. But you need to make sure that you understand what you are doing. So you are creating a specification, and therefore you are committing to continue maintaining that specification so it remains actual and current with the other standards, with the other protocols, with the landscape of technology things that we are having. And you are committing to maintaining it as well at ISO level. So you will have to maintain your specification locally, let's say, at Eclipse, and you will be asked to retranspose at a given period of time. As you can see, at least every 5 years, you will have to determine whether it is still valid or not, and if it is not valid, you will restart and reincorporate new feedback into the specification. And very briefly, why are ISO, IIC, and other SDOs trusting the Eclipse Foundation to become a pass submitter? Because we have what we call the Eclipse Foundation Specification Process. So that's a process we will follow to the word for each and every specification we are doing. And it is trying to make sure that whatever we are doing, it's open, it's transparent, it's vendor neutral, so that we are bringing together all these ideas and taking out this pre-standardization part out of ISO. I would not give many details on this because, well, we already had some talks about this. I see Maria Teresa on the audience. I will not risk saying something stupid on the EFSP. So if you have questions, we can address those later, no problem.
And in fact, I think she made a presentation on this, right?
Right.
People will be able to catch it on YouTube after the conference.
That's right.
Thank you for that.
So basically, what you can see on the screen is the process, the visual representation of the process. So there are rules to propose new specifications, to make them into a given working group, because you need a working group in order to do specifications. You can create the project, you can start developing, and at a given point, you will be willing to release it, so you can start the transposition. So there is a process as well for releasing. What is important about this process? That if you want to specify, you will have to deliver several things. An open specification made by the Eclipse Foundation is made up of at least 3 things. The technical specification itself, so that's clear. Then a TCK, a technology compatibility kit, which is a piece of software which is allowing whoever is willing to test if they are compatible with the specification to do it and to publish the results to claim that they are compatible, and at least one open source implementation of the specification, meaning that there should be an Eclipse project using the specification and releasing a version of their code using that specification. So we are kind of tying the adoption with the specification. So one of the requisites for the pass submission is precisely this, proving that what you are doing is adopted. And this is our way of proving that whatever we are doing is adopted. And basically, it is working this way. You start working separately on those things, on the documentation, on the software modules, on the TCK, on the compatible implementation. You bundle it together, and we have rules for this, and we will guide you through this process. And whenever everything is ready, you can apply for the transposition, and we can start the transposition project at those standardization bodies.
So essentially, the way to understand this diagram is that when you ratify a specification, so when you adopt it, you vote to approve it on the Eclipse side, you vote on a specific release, a specific version of every of the artifacts, TCK, spec document, and of course compatible implementation together. And that together becomes the specification and has a specific version number affixed to it. Okay, and that's really important. The other thing to remember about specification projects also is that those projects, contrarily to Eclipse open source projects for code, Eclipse open source projects for code are not tied to any working group. They have relationships with working groups that are relevant to them, but that's all. But a specification project at Eclipse must exist in the scope of a specification working group. Right now, we have 3 of them: Jakarta EE, Sparkplug, and Data Spaces. Of course, authors can modify their charter to become one, which means essentially that they need to create a specification committee and say in their charter that they follow the Eclipse specification process and that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, taking over success stories. So let's give you some examples of current and future, well, ongoing work, let's say, on standards that we are doing at the foundation. First one being Sparkplug. So Sparkplug is a specification that we submitted for transposition. It's the very first that we did at the foundation. And essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it is a protocol, okay, that is used in industrial automation and uses the MQTT protocol as its own transport. So MQTT was already an ISO IEC standard, as you can see, and essentially Sparkplug goes on the top to provide additional features. So I'm not delving into that. because you don't care, probably. But anyway, the nice thing about Sparkplug is that initially it was not an Eclipse specification. It's been created by Cirrus Link Solutions, an Eclipse Foundation member in 2016. And then they realized, oh, we need to build a community around this. So exactly the process that you were describing. But building a community as a small company around an open technology is really hard work. So how can we make that faster? Well, we contribute to Eclipse, and Eclipse will help us. And that's what we've been doing since 2019. There's an open source implementation of Sparkplug in the Eclipse Tahoe project. And finally, after a year, 18 months of hard work, we were able to ratify the first release of Sparkplug under the Eclipse Specification Process, Sparkplug version 3. And after that, we went to ISO IEC. And now, since October of last year, Sparkplug is also known as ISO IEC 20237. Rolls off the tongue. So, of course, Sparkplug version 3 is just the beginning, so we are working on Sparkplug version 4 right now, so people are working on the Eclipse side of things, trying to figure out what will happen in Sparkplug 4. I put that as a reference if you're curious about it, but I'm not going through this. And really, the goal is to fix pain points that were identified by the standardization community and, of course, the implementation or the end users of Sparkplug in the field to make it better, right? So, plenty of work to be done. And once we are done with that, we hope to have a new version of the specification document by the end of this year on the Eclipse side. And then the TCK in early 2025. Once we have those pieces, we vote on it, and then we start the standardization cycle again. So I get to write a very exciting 20 to 30-page report describing everything, and then putting that on the agenda of meetings and things like that, and asking for an official ballot. But Sparkplug is not the only standard story, and exciting things are happening around data spaces as well.
Indeed. So I will talk now about future work, something that we are doing and hopefully would be transposed into standards. Very quickly, that's the whole picture of what we are trying to do in data spaces. And this is red, as you saw in the previous slide with the boxes, left to right. So we are trying to address everything that we see on the Data Act regarding how data should be shared or how the European Commission is seeing this. And we are trying to drive it through the two middle boxes we saw in the previous slide, standardization and adoption. So that's the minimum set of standards that we think are needed for data spaces, and we are trying to transpose them into standards that are used by our Eclipse data space community that you can see on the lower part of the slide. Basically, before starting into the protocols, you will see this stack of protocols on the right-hand side of the slide. We are very proud of this because it was something that we provided as a conclusion of our preliminary activities in the working group, and it is now pushed as a contribution to ISO IEC Subcommittee 38, which is the one working on data spaces, and they receive it very well. So hopefully this will translate into something that is standardized. So this is the way we see the minimum set of standards. So starting bottom up, the first type of standard we think is needed is the one that is providing technical interoperability, and we call it base protocol. A base protocol is a standard which is dealing with the way we interact with catalogs, the way we interact with contracts, and the way we signal on the control plane the data transferring activities. You might have heard of the Eclipse Data Space Protocol. That's a base protocol. Whoever is using the data space protocol in their data spaces connector should be interoperable by default. If we go one layer above, we can see the what we call claim protocols. So those are messages that are ruling the way we are first issuing our claims and then communicating and transferring and making sure that everybody is aware of what we are doing. What do we mean about claims? For instance, ID certificates, those are claims, but claims are as well metadata descriptions of our assets, regardless if they are data or services. So this protocol is trying to provide the means for whoever is willing to produce this kind of claims to do it in a standardized way so they would be understood by whoever is using this kind of protocols. And if we go to the upper part of the stack, you can see that instead of having just one horizontal protocol, we are having different, as we call them, profiles. Those profiles are ruling what's inside the previous set of messages we are exchanging for claims, for contracting, for negotiating, because we think there should be a unified way, interoperable way of just producing the message flow, and then something different is what is inside those flows. So for instance, here in Europe, we might be willing to be really restrictive about policies, so this is just used inside Europe, or this cannot be accessible for whoever is not using cloud providers that are having their data centers in Europe. So there might be a set of policies, while in Japan or the States, they might be willing to use a different set of policies. The important thing is that regardless of the profile you are using, you should be able to see what is the profile being used on a given data space, and depending on what they are using, agree or disagree to share data within those ecosystems. So that's the way. So we have two profiles. One, which is named the conformity assessment policy and credential profile, which if you are familiar with, this is one coming from the trust framework made by GaiaX. And we have another one which is called the Eclipse Data Rights Policies Profile, which is linked to the iShare Trust Framework. So at the end of the day, those are transpositions of the trust frameworks we see on the data space ecosystem. And having said so, our last slide. So we were trying to see how we do open specification, open standardization, the process, some examples, but this is kind of the takeover message trying to link to the first part. So those are some fun quotes regarding standards. So first one, standards are like toothbrushes, right? You have your own, so you agree that toothbrushes are important, but you are reluctant to use somebody else's toothbrush, right? So takeover message here, make sure that you are doing it the right way, in a consensuated way, in a collaboration with the ecosystem, so that we are not building toothbrushes, let's say, but something else we are willing to use in a collaborative way. Second takeover message, we are all in for standards as long as they are not making us do completely different things. So we are not trying to disrupt anybody's life, we are trying to make things easier. It's good if, or it's fair if you have to do little adaptations, but please don't try to make others do something they are not willing to do, because this won't be accepted at any time. And having said so, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Frederic.
Oh, thank
Happy
you
to answer your questions.
Yep. And hopefully you understand now that you too can be a standards expert.
Right? You can claim your badge as standard experts on your way out.
Yeah, absolutely. So any questions for us? Were we that clear? Impossible. Maria.
I have a question. Thank you for the talk. Is there a time frame that you have established for implementing a standard at the Eclipse Foundation? So once the standard comes, I get that you get the TCK, not a standard, specification project. Mm-hmm. You get the specification project, the TCK, and the implementation. What's usually the time frame there?
It's really variable. If you think about Jakarta EE, you know, the time between Jakarta EE releases is at least, 18 months, 2 years, maybe a bit more for certain components. In the case of Sparkplug, it's a 120-page document, so of course the scope is smaller, but even then, you have to consider that the people working on the spec, this is specialized work. And sometimes, of course, they have day jobs that they need to deliver code to their customers, and that takes priority and that kind of stuff. So in the case of Sparkplug, we ratified Sparkplug on the Eclipse side, if I remember well, in June 2023. And it was published as a standard afterwards. But the time to version 4 will be at least roughly 2 years, even if it's a tiny document, because there's a limited number of contributors on it. In your case, Javier, I'm not sure how complex your specs are.
Yeah, so I would say it depends on the willingness of the committers on the specification project, because at the end of the day, it is their time, their resources. What I can tell you is that, for instance, for data spaces, we started back in January this year. The specification projects were created around summertime, so not so long ago. And the roadmap is trying to have the transposition mechanism initiated by Q1, Q2, 2025. So that's the expectation. So you would say 1 year, a little bit less than a year. So it would depend on how much time and resources the committers can devote.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. Any other question? Oh, over there? No? Okay. Well, if that's all, thank you again, and we appreciate your support.